So tonight is, we've arrived at the 16th century. Last week we ended on the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which is the last kind of step in Europe, because the Jews had been expelled from England in the 13th century, from France in the 14th century, and now from Spain in the 15th century. And so, where do the Jews go once we're expelled? And the general consensus is this period of time sees an eastern migration of Jews. This is where Jews really impact Eastern Europe and ultimately Ottoman Turkey, or Ottoman Israel. So Israel is under the control of the Ottoman Empire at this time, but Jews move there with some sense of protection. So as we see this eastern migration, the great influx of people into Poland and Lithuania in the early 1500s really changes the nature of the Jewish communities there. Suddenly there's a life in these communities. Now, we say that there was 800 years of Jewish settlement in Poland before the Holocaust. So Jews went back in Poland 800 years. There was a Jewish presence. But there's a huge influx after the Spanish expulsion. So we have this understanding or sense that most of the Jews went from Spain to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Israel. And in fact, many people did. That was the path of my wife's family. They were in Spain, they went to Turkey.
Also Greece.
And many went to Greece. And then from Turkey they went to Israel, or at least some parts of her family did. It's interesting, the Spanish government this year has put out a call to Sephardic Jews to reclaim their Spanish citizenship. So that if you can trace your family lineage back to Spain in the 1400s, then the Spanish government will grant you Spanish citizenship.
But very safe.
Huh?
Very safe, and not too many people could do that.
Right. I mean, so my wife's all over this. She's going to do it. There were also, in Eastern Europe, there were a lot of non-Jewish, like the King of Poland, King Casimir, in the beginning of the 16th century, actually encouraged Jews to move to Poland in order to help the economy, raise the education of the country. And it had a huge impact on the Jewish community and their presence in Poland. In Ottoman-controlled Israel, so on from the Sephardic side, Jews were already there building communities, most notably in Sfat, the Safed, northern part of Israel, the Kabbalistic city. And there were some great Kabbalistic rabbis who had gone there to set up shop. So Isaac Luria and Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, these were great mystical leaders, and they brought their communities from Europe to Tzvat and were settled in there in order to create that mystical center that Tzvat became known as. Why Tzvat? It has a lot to do with the terrain, because it's a city that sits on the top of a hill. And there's a whole lot of mystical imagery about hills and being at the top or the apex. And so Tzvat fit a lot of those, kind of parameters. So did Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was a loaded issue because there were other claims on Jerusalem by Muslims and Christians, but no one else cared about Tzvat. It wasn't on their hit parade of important places to be, even though it's kind of in the Galilee, and Christianity puts a lot of importance on the Galilee, but it's not next to the Sea of Galilee, and so it's removed from some of those stories. In this period of time, Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz wrote a poem, a liturgical poem called a piyut, called Lecha Dodi. So that song about this mystical encounter, kind of a wedding between God and the Sabbath bride, emerges out of Tzvat in the early half of the 16th century. The latter half of the 16th century is filled with another great rabbi. His name was Joseph Caro. And Joseph's his great kind of gift is a book or a set of volumes called the Shulchan Aruch, the Ordered Table. It's the code of Jewish law. And so he sits down with the code of law for Sephardic communities and creates a compendium of Jewish law looking at the Jerusalem Talmud. Remember, there were two, Babylonia and Jerusalem. He looks at the Jerusalem Talmud and he creates a code of Jewish law. Well, that's great if you're Sephardic, but what happens if you're not? What if you're European, Ashkenazic? So another scholar in Poland, a guy named Rabbi Moses Isserlis, does the exact same thing. He takes the Babylonian Talmud and first of all he says, the Shulchan Aruch of Joseph Caro is not complete yet. He says the table is not set. And so he creates something and he calls it the Ramah. The Mapah, which means tablecloth. So he had the table, but no tablecloth. So together, the Mapah and the Shulchan Aruch formed this code of Jewish law. And instead of creating two separate documents, they were blended together into one. Great sense of Jewish continuity. And that all happens in that kind of 16th century. So the 16th century is kind of a re-engagement, So we had the golden years in the previous section of time, the golden years of Spain, the kind of growth of Judaism under Islamic rule. Then we had tragedy. We had expulsions, and we left, and now we're going to regroup in the 16th century and create something else, a whole new level of engagement. And so the birth of mysticism, not really the birth, the flourishing of mysticism in Safed, the creation of the Code of Jewish Law, the merging of two cultures, Sephardic and Ashkenazic Judaism, under one kind of umbrella. And this is all very positive, but there's some huge negative that has to happen. So, in 1596, Shakespeare writes The Merchant of Venice. Now, why is that an issue? Shylock. For 200 years, Jews have not had a presence in Western Europe. So we had been swept out of England, swept out of France, swept out of Spain, pushed eastward. So we have an Eastern European presence, but no Western European presence. And we know that a world without a Jewish presence quickly becomes a very unfriendly place for Jews. So Shakespeare writes The Merchant of Venice. Did he even know a Jew?
Yes.
Did he?
Yes.
Probably it was his mistress. The Zanos were a very prominent Jewish family.
Okay.
The court musicians, lots of evidence that he knew Jews. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't there that article in Reform Judaism that said one of the
Right.
Messiahs was actually Shakespeare?
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Right, yes.
That's right. So, and Shakespeare, I mean, because he's so popular, it's easy to grab Shylock. I mean,
Right.
that's a much more humane character than all the other
Oh,
Jewish
sure.
villains stomping around.
Oh, for sure.
But still, I know
The
you.
popularity is important, as far as
But
spreading the word.
there was this absence of engagement in Western Europe with Jews as Jews. Maybe living as conversos or secreted Jews or under assumed names, but there was a kind of an emptiness. And so what happens is that, and it's not just Shakespeare, we're also going to see the rise of another young man, a monk, by the name of Martin Luther. And Martin Luther is going to create the Reformation. He is going to target the Jews that he believes should buy his homogenized version of Christianity. And when we don't, what happens? He turns against the Jews, and in 1543 writes a book called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies, which is this huge assault on the Jewish faith. And so, we see in this while we move east and we flourish in the east, there's still this trail behind us of, I don't want to say destruction, but of angst and anxiety. And then we're in the 1600s. And the only thing that I can say about the 1600s is Himmel Mickey. Khmelnytsky was a massacre. He was a leader of the Cossacks who led a revolt against the Polish rulers of the Ukraine. And the Jews were kind of caught in this. And the Khmelnytsky pogroms killed 100,000 Jews. 7.5% of the Jewish population of Poland was murdered during the Khmelnytsky pogroms. And we don't talk about that very much. I mean, we know it, pogroms, Fiddler on the Roof, we kind of make light of it, but 100,000 of the 1.2 million Jews in Poland were murdered in 1648. And the world didn't blink an eye.
Was it 1 year in that 1 year?
Yeah.
Was there a particular rationale?
So the rationale was because the Jews were well educated, knew how to read and write, we served as representatives of the Polish nobility in their businesses, in government, in all levels of Polish society. So when the peasants of the Polish countryside rose up against the Polish nobility, there was no distinction between, it was kind of the same kind of problem. The Jews are controlling the government, the resources, the farmlands, they're enslaving the peasants, and so the Jews were the ultimate scapegoats during those pogroms. And I didn't remember that number. 7.5% of the Jews of Eastern Europe were killed in these pogroms. So, of course, they're not comparable to the Holocaust, but it's certainly comparable in terms of its barbarism and the loss of a generation of people. More than 300 Jewish communities were destroyed. And it wasn't uncommon at this point. So 1648, middle of the 17th century. It wasn't uncommon for many Jews to say, the end of the world is near, the Messiah must be coming. Because, the kind of stuff that happens when 7.5% of your population disappears overnight is the kind of stuff that Jewish theologians say, that's what Isaiah is talking about, that there's going to be this terrible destruction and then this kind of messianism, re-rising, the phoenix rising from the ashes. And so who pops on the scene during this time? Right. Shabbatai Tzvi in 1665. So Shabbatai Tzvi he's not in Poland. He's in Turkey. All right? So he's in Turkey, and together with his kind of right-hand man who was named Nathan of Gaza, they came to the Jewish community in Turkey, and he revealed himself as Messiah. Right. I am it. And he abolished the fast of the 9th of Av. He said, no more, we're done. I'm the Messiah. Life is going to be good again. He announced that he was going to take back Jerusalem from the from the Turks, and reestablish the dynasty of King David. So the Ottomans controlled Israel, and you can imagine the Sultan was not very happy with this revelation by Shabtai Tzvi. So the Sultan sent for him, brought him to the palace, threw him in shackles, put him in the dungeon, and demanded that he either recant or convert to Islam, or he was going to be killed. And Shabtai Tzvi chose to convert. And suddenly the great Messiah, who had been there to save the Jews from Chmielnicki and the pogroms that were going on in Europe and the terrible world that they were living in, was now a Muslim. There were still Jews, even after that, who believed he was the Messiah.
And was he led out of jail after that?
Yes.
Okay.
And they said that Shabbatai Tzvi, in a good mystical fashion, had to descend to the depths of darkness in order to find the sparks, the klipot of the mystical light. Then the Sultan had him beheaded. And Jews were finally convinced that he was not the Messiah. And many of Shabtai Tzvi's followers gave up their homes. They had gone into exile to kind of follow Shabtai Tzvi, and the despair poured forth in the Jewish world. So the 17th century was really dark. You had Chmielnicki, and you had Shabtai Tzvi and this crushed, this messianism, and the Jews were depressed. Terrible psychological and emotional losses, physical blows from the pogroms, and this set the scene for what, for our modern time, is the great revolution in Jewish life. And that is the rise of the Hasidic movement and ultimately the rise of Reform Judaism. So let's stop here. Let's talk about the first kind of 200 years moving east in this anti-Judaism period. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Isn't that the period in which Jews first came to America from Brazil? When the Dutch ran New Amsterdam?
Right. So, as we talked about last week, right. So the first, the question of whether Jews on Columbus's ships, and did they go to Recife? Did they get off the boat? Luis de Torres, was he was Columbus's kind of bookkeeper, and there's a lot of evidence that he was Jewish, and so they settle in Recife, and then move up with the Dutch West Indies.
I thought they were Dutch who came from New Amsterdam to Brazil and petitioned the Dutch government to let them in. And Peter Steiner said no, the Dutch government said yes.
Right. True. I mean, definitely the settlers of Recife. But there was, I was reading something, I think when I was in Newport at the temple, about Luis de Torres, who was part of Columbus's ships, of laying the groundwork for that much later.
Wasn't there also a settlement in Curacao at that time, in the 17th century? I thought the oldest temple in the Western Hemisphere was Curacao. Is that the case?
It's the oldest continuous.
We saw it. We were there.
Right. It's not the oldest. It's the oldest continuous temple. in the Western Hemisphere. So the Jews who were in Recife, which would be older than the Curacao temple, must have had a building, must have had a synagogue of some sort. But when they moved to New Amsterdam, that community probably faded. But I think the temple in Curacao is definitely the oldest in the Western Hemisphere of continual use. And just as Newport is the oldest in the continental U.S. of continual use. Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, as we're learning about the history, but talking about all the Jews who have been murdered and disbanded and dispersed and converted, it just seems amazing to me that there's still Jews on this earth. You know, right? So it's just hitting me.
Yeah. Right. So what keeps us together?
Right. Yes.
How do we survive oppression and exile? We have that prayer in our prayer book. We've survived oppression and exile time and again, overcoming the forces that would have destroyed us. And there's a prayer that says that. Why? How? And I think a lot of it has to do with a biblical concept of messianism, of that God's never going to break that covenant. We have to hold on to it. And so we hold on to our Judaism because we want to be there at the end.
I think a lot of it also has to do with what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And I mean, you could make a Darwinian argument as well, I think, for survival. I think it's possible that the Jews are, as a result of all of these killings and persecutions and such, that they end up somewhat more capable than their non-Christian fellows. Let's put it that way.
But they didn't die by the Darwinian way. They didn't die by natural selection.
I got caught.
I'm saying, if you don't survive, it was an interesting thought.
So here we are at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. Judaism's a pretty depressed place. We've been through hell and back again, and we need something. So we need to be elevated. We're living in poverty in Eastern Europe. Ignorance and depression abounded amongst the Jews because people couldn't take the time out to learn because they were trying to grow their potatoes. While people were still committed to covenantal Jewish living, there was something missing. So along came a guy named Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer. Israel ben Eliezer is known by the moniker Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov was a storyteller. That's all he was. He was an itinerant, wandering storyteller. And we don't know a whole lot about it, where he came from, or what his youth was like, or anything like that. We do know that once he was a rabbi, he was a teacher of children. He was a teacher. He was what we would call a maggid. He would go from town to town, telling stories and teaching lessons about ethics and morality and Jewish life. And more students became attracted to him. and they were influenced by his teachings, and eventually the Baal Shem Tov's students became the next generation of teachers of Hasidism. Okay? So Hasidism, this movement, which he did not intend to create, but was kind of just created around him, caught Eastern European Jews by fire. Because they needed something. They were living a very depressed life. It emphasized that if you wanted to, even if you were not a great intellectual, you could become a righteous person and connect to God. Up until that point, especially in Eastern Europe, only the wealthy were allowed to study. I mean, you had to pay for a malamed, a teacher. And if your family didn't have money, you couldn't go to learn. And so Judaism was becoming the kind of the study of Judaism was becoming the vocation of only the wealthy Jews in the community. But he turned that on its head. He said, even those who were not great students should still have the opportunity to sit with the great rabbis. He began to experiment with spontaneity in worship. So worship became something more alive than it had been. You know, it's like, think about our own service. What would happen in our service if suddenly everyone got up and grabbed arms and started to dance the hora? It would be, I mean, people would look at me like I was absolutely insane, that I had fallen off the turnip truck. But for him, that kind of spontaneity, this abject joy of worship, became what Hasidism was known for. It enabled common Jews to engage the framework of Judaism, and people who had been depressed or alienated or marginalized began to grow in their engagement and their fervor. The students of the Baal Shem Tov became known as Rebbes. R-E-B-B-E. So not rabbis, but Rebbes. And the Rebbe became the leader of a particular group. So, you know, that's what, you know, when we think about Hasidism, we think about a group, but it's really a dozen different groups that follow a dozen different traditions, or Rebbes. They were generally associated with the towns they came from. So Gur became if you were from Gur, you're a Gerer. If you're from Belz, you're a Belzer. If you're from Lubov, you're a Lubavitch. If you're from a Satmar, if you're from Satmar, you're a Satmar. And so there are a dozen different Hasidic groups. Now, I happen to have a very strange set of in-laws. And so my mother-in-law's sister lives in Tel Aviv. They were very secular. Her children, she has 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. The son became connected to Lubavitch while they live in Israel. And so he became a Lubavitch chassid. The daughter fell in love with someone who was a Satmar chassid. The third daughter is secular. And so the Lubavitch son and the Satmar daughter won't eat each other's food because they have different hechshers on them. So my aunt has to have 2 refrigerators, not for meat and milk, but 2 meat refrigerators, one for the Lubavitch son and one for the Satmar daughter. And then she has a third one that's milk.
That's the fourth one. That's the fourth one.
That's the one in the garage.
That's the one for the Chinese food in the back.
Only goes to McDonald's, right?
So it's crazy, and they
Will
won't.
they eat together at the same meal? I mean, do they socialize together?
They don't do it very easily. There's a whole lot of.
Does she have to have different plates for them?
They didn't even start out that way.
Yeah. So and they didn't start out that way because she wasn't religious, but somehow they found this. And so but there's all these different groups, and the position of the Rebbe of these groups generally passes from father to son. And so we know in Lubavitch today, it's been a few years, but a bunch of years ago, there was talk that Menachem Schneerson, who was head of the Lubavitch, who was the Rebbe of the Lubavitch movement, was the Messiah. And so there was all this talk amongst the Lubavitch that he was the Messiah, and before he could come out and answer the question, he had a stroke, lost the ability to speak. And so his followers remained convinced that he was the Messiah.
I got an email weekly from
And Lubavitchers in the 80s were walking around with pagers, believing that he was going to get his voice, he was going to walk out on his balcony in Brooklyn or wherever it is and announce that he was the Messiah, and everyone was heading to the airport, and they were all on a plane to Israel because, that was the plan. They had to be in Israel when he announced that he was the Messiah. And then he died. And some of them felt that, well, he died, he'll come back. And others felt he died and he's gone and there's no Messiah, and they stopped it. But that's how the movements operated. They are, all of them, ultra-Orthodox. They follow the teachings of their Rebbe. And that Rebbe has been passed on from generation to generation. And even though the Talmud may say one thing, the teachings of the Rebbe are more valid than the Talmud. Now I say that because that's going to become important for our next conversation. So the other, so that's Hasidism. It's kind of emerges out of this depression of, Eastern Europe following the Khmelnytsky massacres and this great depression in the human psyche that was going on, and they found joy in this Hasidism, this fluidity of faith, expression of personal joy that really the Baal Shem Tov brought to Eastern Europe. So there are a couple of other really important leaders this time. Someone who I've spent a lot of time studying is a guy named Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And Luzzatto was a mystic storyteller who lived at the beginning of the 18th century, so, 1707 to 1747. Those were his years. And he starts his journey in Frankfurt. And at the age of 23, began to write and teach. An amazing story. He wrote a couple of theological books. One was called The Path of the Just, which is how you, in essence, rise in relationship to God. So you start first at this bottom level, and then you become watchful and mindful, and you engage in certain customs and traditions, and you become more fearful or awestruck, and you rise in relationship to God. And if that's what he had taught, it would have been okay. But Luzzatto also taught that the reason he knows this is because there was a Maggid that followed him. Okay? So you say there's a storyteller. Follow him. No. He understood the Maggid as God, sitting on his shoulder, advising him in every conversation that he was in. And the rabbis of Frankfurt said, Genug, we're no way. We're not having that in our community. We're not going to have you walking around town thinking you're talking to someone on your shoulder. And so they placed him in harem.
Where?
Harem. So what's a harem? A harem is a rabbinic band. So all the rabbis of Frankfurt got together. They signed this document that said, Luzzatto is banned from Frankfurt.
Shaking some lithium.
So they signed that, all the rabbis signed it. They sent it out to all the communities around Europe. And where was Luzzatto going to go? So he flees Frankfurt and he goes to Amsterdam. And so he's in Amsterdam and he's doing the same thing, telling the same story. He actually writes in Amsterdam some plays, theological plays, about his teachings, and they're phenomenal. But the rabbis in Frankfurt heard that he was in Amsterdam, and so they sent their letters to Amsterdam, and all of a sudden the rabbis in Amsterdam are saying, we don't want this guy here. If they don't want him in Frankfurt, we don't want him in Amsterdam, and so they signed a harem too. So now he can't go to Frankfurt or Amsterdam. So where's he going to go? So he's in Amsterdam, he boards a ship and sets sail for Tel Aviv. All right? And so somewhere along that ship, along that long journey from Amsterdam around to Tel Aviv, he gets sick. He arrives in Tel Aviv and dies like 6 months later. of consumption or some disease. But his teaching is very important because, again, in the same way the Baal Shem Tov did, he humanized his teaching. It wasn't teaching way up here. It wasn't teaching only for the most erudite. It was an accessible teaching for people on the street who had no background, no knowledge, no engagement.
So it was accepted by people, like the general.
Right,
Jews.
so his writings were preserved, because typically if you were placed in harem, your writings were burned. Spinoza was placed in harem. He had a ban on him. His writings were preserved, though, but there were kind of historical events of the burning of Spinoza's theologies. Same thing happened to Luzzatto. The good thing for Luzzatto is he only really angered two communities before he left the countries and went to Israel.
But did he have actual people who were followers?
Students.
Even though he was there, then was there something?
So there were a small group of people who followed him. Luzzatto's writings have become repopularized in the 20th century. I would imagine they weren't studied very much in the 18th century or the 19th. But once the 20th century rolled around, I think the world caught up to his teachings. Another great figure during this time was the Gaon of Vilna. Right? So Vilna, huge center of Jewish learning in Eastern Europe. The Gaon of Vilna, his name was Rabbi Elijah Kramer. And he was a true genius of Jewish learning. He popularized Torah study. He said, Torah studying the Parsha of the week, is the most important thing any person can do with their time. His son reported that his father never slept more than 2 hours a night. And he was spending the rest of the time studying. He is truly known by his erudition, but probably his greatest concept is that he was an opponent of the Baal Shem Tov. So while Hasidism is talking about fluidity and love and light and all those mystical traditions and kind of elevating the soul and the spirit, the Gaon is grounded in Torah study, learning mitzvahs, following the Torah, understanding the text. And so they were at loggerheads, tradition versus innovation. The Gaon's opposition to Hasidism might be compared to a symphony. Two different conductors can conduct the same piece of music, but they have a different feeling about the text. As part of an orchestra, the Gaon says you can't be too spontaneous. You got to follow the notes. If you're not following the notes, then you're missing the beauty of the text. So he also feared that while all the Hasidic Rebbes were dancing and singing and emoting everywhere, they were losing connection to And so the Gaon of Vilna excommunicated or placed in harem some of the Hasidic rabbis, which didn't bode too well with communications. So, there's a, so the fear that the Gaon kind of presented was, never came to be. The Hasidic movement flourished, and Torah study flourished. He was afraid that one would overpower the other. Some would argue that the battle of the Gaon in opposition to the Hasidic leaders, pushed the Hasidim to elevate scholarship in their own movement, which may have been a good thing. So here we have, kind of this tension in Hasidism between that and the next step, which is what the Gaon really represents, is the Haskalah, or the Enlightenment. So now we're at the end of the 1700s. And what's going on in the world at the end of the 1700s, into the 18th century?
Exploration.
Huh?
Revolution.
Revolution. Okay. The French Revolution. So how does the French Revolution affect the Jews? So, this little short guy named Napoleon, all right, who didn't know much about Judaism at all, but knew a whole lot about individual rights and freedoms, felt that all people should be emancipated, free to be who they were. So up until almost 1800, Jews throughout Europe paid, every religious community paid a tax, a religious tax. So wherever you lived, you paid your religious tax. Your religious tax went to the accepted religious authority, which was for Judaism. There was only one. There was a community. And that religious authority then helped to fund religious institutions. You didn't join a temple. The community provided a temple. And so the religious authority created that temple, or that, the synagogue, the shul, if you will, because that's who was in the community that provided the tax. What Napoleon did in the emancipation of the Jews was remarkable, because he said to the Jews, as he said to other Christians, you can pick who you want your religious tax to support. So the community, the central community authority, no longer had authority. And Jews who were more liberal-minded, because they had encountered Luther's Reformation, and they had encountered or heard Protestant church music and all of the gestalt that created, suddenly began to have a conversation about that. I mean, if Hasidism could bring music to worship, couldn't we elevate that music even more so with a nice pipe organ? or a violin. And so the Napoleon's emancipation of the Jews was the catalyst that ultimately gave rise to Reform Judaism. Because what Napoleon allowed was Jewish autonomy. And never before had that been allowed. The Jews lived in a ghetto or in a neighborhood, and all the synagogues were there, and they were all the same, and there was no real, I mean, you could have found a Hasidic synagogue or a Misnagid, synagogue, or you could find that, but there was all Orthodox, because that's all there was. And Napoleon said, no, you can pick your own. You can have your own space. And so Jews began a conversation. The first Reform congregation was established in Hamburg, Germany in 1810. And it was established to look just like everything else. So Orthodox liturgy, all in Hebrew, separate men and women seating, everything was exactly the same. The only addition was music. That was the only change. Cataclysmic change within Judaism. Because why can't you play an instrument on Shabbat? No. Playing an instrument is not work. It's really not. It's not considered work. Why can't you play a musical instrument on Shabbat? It's not about the playing. It is if you have a musical instrument on Shabbat, your mind is caught, this is the rabbinic argument, your mind is caught up into the music and the melody and the joy and all that piece. What happens if it's not there? Suddenly stops. What happens if the instrument breaks on Shabbat? Does that mean your worship would be meaningless because you're accustomed to having the music? It is the repair of the instrument that is forbidden on Shabbat. So since the repair is forbidden, the insertion of the instrument is forbidden, because you shouldn't have something in the worship that can't be
Ridiculous argument.
That's the responsa literature's argument on the reason why musical instruments are not allowed. Now, that was based on a whole lot of discussion about distractions during worship. And so, if music, which most of us would identify as an addition, were suddenly absent, would the absence of an addition be a subtraction from the worship experience? And the answer that most rabbis would say is yes. And so therefore, if you had something that was a zero sum, and you added or then subtracted so that it was a negative, then that would be a problem for the nature of Jewish worship. So the first change was just that, music. Then we began to, the second change was changing the sermon. Up until the beginning of the 19th century, sermons were done in Yiddish or in Hebrew. They were not done in the vernacular of the country.
How about in the Sephardic community? Was it done in Hebrew or?
Ladino or Hebrew.
So
And so,
Ladino or Yiddish was the language of the country.
right. What?
That was the language
Right.
that they spoke.
Right. But they were never in the language, in the native language of the country. Until the beginnings of the 19th century. Now, this only happens because in the early 1800s, Moses Mendelssohn translates the Hebrew Bible into German. So suddenly there was a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible into another language. And people began to actually understand it because it was in Hebrew before. And if you weren't a student of Hebrew, if you weren't fluent in Hebrew, what would you get out of it other than reading it? I mean, probably all of us can follow along with the Hebrew, but we don't know what it says, or at least not every word. Imagine listening to a sermon in Hebrew and not understanding every word the rabbi said. And then going the next week and the sermon's in English. So that's what you meant, or that's what you said. So changing the language of that piece of the service was huge. Now in the Orthodox congregations, it was still in Hebrew. But in the new Reformed congregation, it was suddenly in German.
When did cantors become cantors become integrated into the service?
Well, so that the cantor as a clergy,
There's a certain sound of an Orthodox synagogue that's in my head from being a kid. Right? No music, just that sound.
Right.
So when did
Chant.
when did, or whatever, mumbling, whatever it is, when did music in the form of a cantor's voice,
chazanut, so the cantorial music.
Yes.
So much of the cantorial music emerges probably in the beginning of the 19th century. There are some melodies, certainly like L'Chadodi, so it goes back to the 16th century.
At least the text.
The text does. So I don't know when the musical notation for L'Chadodi was created. There was probably a melody that was associated well before the 19th century. Now, most of the melodies that we use today, a lot of them, which we believe are from Moses, are really only about 150 or 200 years old.
So back in the 1500s, they just read.
Well,
They didn't chant melodies or anything like that.
so Torah had been chanted. The system of trope goes back to the Masoretes in the 9th century. So were other prayers chanted using that system of trope? Conceivably. Were there other songs sung? Well, if you go to the temple period, that's what the Levites did. They were the Levitical singers. They sang the psalms. And much of the Psalms are written, with lute or lyre or, with orchestration. But we don't know what they sounded like because we don't have sheet music from the 2nd century before the Common Era. There was no sheet music discovered in Qumran that I'm aware of. So music as a part of the service is old. Now having a person, a clergy, as cantor, as distinctive from the rabbi, not sure. Not sure. So, Reform is born really because Napoleon allows the Jews to move out of the ghetto. Napoleon allows us to live amongst the population. We hear the beautiful organs coming from the Protestant churches. And we say, why can't we have that?
So the Catholic churches would have done, in France.
Yeah.
Yes, because Protestant churches did that. That's a good one.
So we turn, from that. So that simple act is a huge revolution within Judaism. And it really begins with the Hasidic movement, which takes that first step to rebel or move away from the, tied in a neat little box orthodoxy that had existed through Europe before that. And so while Hasidism moved the bar a bit, then came Reform, who moved it even further. And that innovation and expression became a constant dialogue, which is why we are reformed. We are not reformed. There was no end of that event. And there are so many, rabbi pet peeve number 136 is people who refer to us as Reformed Jews. I haven't reformed from anything, but we are Reformed Jews, and that's a process that is an ongoing process. There are Reformed Jews who feel the process should have stopped in the 1950s, and there are those who feel it should keep going.
So here we're listening to all this history of the opposite Jews. So here's the non sequitur. Where do women come in to the story, and what role do they have, especially with the beginning of Reform Judaism?
Right.
So, I don't know if you want to answer that now or just.
Well,
Since they're not there.
Well,
It's very
Right, they're not required.
the answer is ultimately women as partner, as Jewish. Women's self-actualization coincides with the movement from Europe to the United States. So as Reform Judaism moved from Europe to the United States in the 1850s, the engagement of women in Reform Jewish congregations began. It did not begin in Europe. So if you went to European Reform congregations at the same time, women were still sitting separate from men. But in the U.S., the Mechitza was done away with.
And they counted?
Didn't count.
Didn't count.
So counting comes later,
Okay.
all right? But having a role and a presence changed here. So women became much more purposeful in a Reformed congregation in the United States. Counting in a minion,
I mean, anybody.
so I would have to say women did not count in a minion in most Reformed congregations until 1927.
What was that date?
The suffragette,
Oh,
1922.
Okay.
That's when we got the right
So
to
inside of
vote.
the United States, the whole.
Yeah, right to vote, you
Yeah,
know.
okay.
I would say it coincided with that. Because that also gave rise to so the first bat mitzvah.
It was me.
Right. So the first bat mitzvah in a Reformed congregation was in the 1920s. I think maybe no. Let me back that out. So Mordechai Kaplan,
Before he became?
before he became Reconstructionist,
Okay.
was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So he was a conservative rabbi at JTS. 1927, he wanted his daughter to read from Torah to have a bat mitzvah at JTS. All right? And he appealed, he went to the faculty, they voted him down. All right? So he left JTS, moved to Philadelphia, and founded the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where his daughter read from Torah. They didn't call it a bat mitzvah, because she was older then. But I think so in 1945, my mother had a bat mitzvah. And in our Reformed congregation in Houston, that was the first one. So I don't know prior to that, where women first began to have benot mitzvah. And I know she wasn't the first in the country, but it had to have been in that period of time between 35 and 45 that women began to read from Torah and at that point be counted as part of the making. So, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, Reform Judaism, moving from Europe to the United States, was the next logical place. Isaac Mayer Wise, who was a European rabbi, came to the United States, first to Albany, New York, where he developed the idea to create an American Judaism. Not an orthodoxy or a reform, but an American Judaism. And he thought that he could create a consortium of all Jewish congregations under one kind of rubric, which is why our movement was called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Because he didn't want the Union of Reform Jewish congregations. He wanted everybody together. It never worked. But in Albany, New York, what happened was his ideas did not float well with the leadership of the congregation. And he was a bit of a firebrand and an inflammatory figure. And on Yom Kippur, his second year in Albany, New York, in the middle of his sermon, the president stood up on the pulpit and punched him in the face.
It's a very secret thing to do.
And Isaac Mayer won because of what he was saying, and he was lambasting the leadership of the congregation for not doing something. It was a typical Isaac Mayer wise moment. And so he leaves. They ran him out of town on a rail. He gets on a train in Albany, New York, and he ends up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is why the Reform movement is founded in Cincinnati, Ohio. You know,
Amazing how things are.
and he ends up in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Plum Street Temple as their rabbi, where he establishes the UAHC and the CCAR and ultimately Hebrew Union College, the rabbinic school. And so Cincinnati becomes the hub of Reform Judaism, because as you moved out, as you moved out of New York, you're in the wilderness, you know, and you could do things in the wilderness that you couldn't do in the city, and that's what he found, and that's why he created.
Were there any Jews there?
Yes.
There was a community there, right?
Sure. I mean, Cincinnati was a river town. There was a Jewish world there. There were traders and merchants, and it was a happening city at that point.
This is the late 19th century?
This is the middle of the 19th century. So, like 1855.
Before the Civil War.
Before the Civil War. And so he is going to establish his dream. He's not the only one. So you had Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati, you had David Einhorn, who was in Baltimore, you had a couple of other big names in the Reform movement who were very, who were kind of big picture people. But Isaac Mayer Wise wins out over all of them. And sometimes there's, debate, what prayer book, whose prayer book, and everyone writes their own prayer book, and Isaac Mayer Wise wins out. But American Judaism, or Reform Judaism in America, takes off to a place that it could never go in Europe. Reform Judaism in Europe is still a very small entity. Right? There are Reform congregations in London, in England. There are Reform congregations in Germany. There is a Reform presence in Sweden, in France. There are no Reform congregations in Italy or Spain. There's a Reform congregation in Budapest. Trying to think if there's others that I'm aware of.
What do you think the reason for that is that it didn't take off in those in Europe?
Because Europe, everything is so controlled by a central authority, still in Europe, that even though Napoleon created this great, they backed way off of the Napoleonic Reformation and Revolution. And so much of that control kind of rested back into old systems. Much of these countries, England, for example, still operates with a chief rabbi. There's a chief rabbi of England. He's Orthodox. He's a pretty nice guy, but not necessarily a friend to Reform Judaism.
I viewed his installation speech on YouTube a few days ago. Rabbi Murphy's.
Right. He's the new one.
Yeah.
So, that's why Reform Judaism has struggled in Israel, but for other reasons. But the 19th century is now, so we moved west after the destructions of the temples. We moved east after the massacres, after the exiles and expulsions. We then moved further east after the massacres, and then the kind of the 19th century brings a whole westward flow again. So we ask the question, why are we the wandering Jews? And we just have to look at our history. We're kind of constantly on the move, east or west. There's never a whole period of time where we're set and stable. That's very telling of our story. Any questions?
Well,
Yes.
Yes.
So, a Reform temple in the mid-late 19th century
Uh-huh.
had separation of sexes. I'm asking a question. I don't know.
So once
You
Wise,
Yeah.
once Wise comes to Cincinnati,
Right.
and he opens up the door here, and
I'm just trying to understand where it
the
was as far as.
Mechitzas kind of disappear. So,
It's one space, if there's any separation.
well, across, Mechitzas across.
No, I'm not thinking about the Plum Street synagogue.
Right.
Right.
Well, there's a balcony. There's a
just
second
trying-
level.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the second level wasn't for women.
Mhm.
Right. Plum Street was built after Plum Street was there when Wise arrived. But I think he changed the Mechitza issue pretty quickly. I don't have my Reform Jewish dates in the back of my head anymore. But I would imagine by the 1870s, there were no Mechitzas in Reform congregations. Reform congregations had, by that point, adopted Wise's liturgy. They've either adopted Wise's or Einhorn's prayer book. There were two prayer books competing. They had they didn't allow women to read from Torah, but I believe women could be on the pulpit by that point, just not reading from Torah.
And weren't counted.
And they weren't counted.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I don't believe they were-
You said it was with the liberation
Right.
early, you said it was early 1900s.
Right,
Now,
so I don't believe that women were counted in the minion until the early 1900s, early 20th
because they
century.
weren't separated.
Right.
They certainly have been more part of progressive movement in general in terms of women, right? As opposed to
Oh,
conservative.
of course. So, you know, the Reconstructionist movement was the first movement to accept a woman into rabbinic school, but the Reform movement was the first one to ordain a woman as a rabbi.
Wait, what happened to the other one?
She took too long.
What was the difference in time? Was it like 20 years?
It's a couple of years.
It's like-
Yeah, it was a couple of
They were
years.
competing.
I actually think it was 1 year.
1 year.
Yeah, I think-
And the woman who was first accepted just had a complete.
Right.
Mhm.
There's one aspect that you haven't covered yet, Lady Liberty, the
Right.
great Jewish migration from 1850 until immigration was cut off in this country, about 1914. The
Right.
labor rights of the labor. I don't know if you wanted to, I just.
Yeah, you know, I kind of put that up there because I do view the Jews coming to the United States, especially Reform Judaism coming to the United States, as another level of our freedom. Because I don't believe that if Judaism was relegated to Europe, that Reform Judaism would have grabbed hold. Because the values and culture and sensibilities of European society were very different than the values and cultures and sensibilities of American society. And especially as you moved out of the eastern corridor of the U.S. and began to move west, the idea of orthodoxy surviving through the Western migration of Jews across this country as the only option would have been impossible. My family lived in Hamburg in 1810. My father's family were part of the first Reformed congregation in Hamburg. They then left Hamburg to go, of all places, to the Yucatan Peninsula.
And was that just, you know, what?
So someone was, the ancestor that left was a physician who decided he was wanted to do research on the native population of the Yucatan. So he boarded a ship, packed up all of his belongings, set sail. The ship docked in New Orleans. He found that there were Jews there. He fell in love with a girl while the ship was in New Orleans, but she was too young for him to marry. Father wouldn't let him marry her. So he went down to the Yucatan and came back 10 years later and married her. Then he went back to the Yucatan, and then there was this little revolution in Texas. Ended up coming up from the Yucatan to Texas. And had they not been Reformed Jews, had they not lived in a world of compromise and acquiescence, and decision making, they would have disappeared as Jews, doing what he did. Or he would have never gone, or he would have just stayed in New Orleans. And so that's the story of Pancho Lipper. Yes. There really is a guy named Pancho Lipper. So, kind of up to 1900, more or less. We're going to stop here. Next week we're going to finish. We're going to move from 1900 to 2014. And we're going to look specifically at Zionism. Because for the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, Zionism as a philosophy has been one of the motor ideas keeping Jews engaged beyond our own Jewish practice. So, till we meet again.
Suggested reading Promised Land.
Huh?
Suggested reading Promised Land.